Okay, thanks everybody for coming to this. This title of Sex, Class and Women's Oppression is one that, to me, isn't talked about nearly enough on the left, isn't something that is regarded as a kind of major question by lots of people, not just on the left, obviously, in society as a whole. And we've got this weird situation where you have a society which has a kind of, in Britain at least, and in most of the developed world, you have this kind of commitment to women's equality and the idea that, there should be complete equality. Isn't it a shame that there isn't complete equality? But actually, at the same time, there's a glaring gap between that aspiration and what is actually happening to women. And I would argue in lots of ways the situation of women is becoming worse despite the advances that women have made. And I want to just go through some of these questions and look at where women's oppression come from. But I want to start off with the fact that women do far more work overall within society than men. Absolutely no question about it. If you look at any way it's measured, there's lots of different ways of measuring it, but the United Nations actually has the idea that there's 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work. Women do 2.5 times more of that than men do. Now, obviously, that's not the only domestic work, if you like. I mean, there's gardening, there's decorating, there's cleaning, there's all sorts of other things. But essentially, women do the vast majority of the unpaid care and household work in the world. And again, it varies a lot from different countries, but that is a standard thing anywhere. There is nowhere where women do less caring and housework anywhere in the world, to the best of my knowledge. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So there's that. We also, as women, have our wages stolen from us. Now, as workers, all of us have our wages stolen from us by the system of exploitation, which means that they take a huge amount of profit for the companies off the actual amount of wealth that we create. But when you look at what happens to women, you find that that is even more the case. That again, systematically, women earn less money than men, and they do so on a regular basis. And in fact, they now have this thing in this country called the gender pay gap, which is a kind of aspiration. There's this gender pay gap between men and women. Isn't it terrible that women effectively stop earning from about the middle of November to the end of the year? If you look at how much they get that is less than men. But this is kind of regarded as something that gradually we're going to overcome this, and gradually year after year there'll be a 15% pay gap, then a 10% pay gap, then 5%, and then utopia will all get paid exactly the same as men. Well, actually, you look at the Financial Times last week, because they do this gender pay gap, and every company 250 has to report their gender pay gap. What do we find? We find Clifford Chase, HSBC and McKinsey, all of them gigantic companies based in the City of London, all of them, their gender pay gap has got worse. And in the case of, I think it's McKinsey, there is a 38% gender pay gap between men and women. So in terms of the work that women do, in terms of the reward, if you want to call it that, for what they do, and in terms of the attitudes for women. And the third example I want to give is actually the topical example of the Epstein files and what that says about how women are treated. And I don't know if people saw Melania Trump's. Weird, wasn't it? I thought, when I first saw it, I thought it was AI, and I didn't realise it was actually a genuine thing. And apparently her husband didn't know what she was going to do the press conference on. Obviously, there's not a lot going on there. But if you look at the Epstein thing, what you're talking about is you have to see it as a ruling class conspiracy for some of the richest people in the world, effectively to traffic women across the world for prostitution, for sex, for exploitation by men. Now, everyone kind of, we're all up in horror about this now, or, this has suddenly become a major issue. But this is something that goes on all the time. We know that from Britain, that two of the most powerful men in Britain were very closely involved with Epstein. That's the man formerly known as Prince, now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and Peter Mandelson, who apparently, according to Private Eye, even the King didn't want him to be the ambassador to Washington, but he still got the job anyway, so you kind of wonder what's going on there as well. This is a huge operation going on, and you look at every area that Epstein got into finance, into politics, into the royal family, into culture, into arts, all these sorts of things. The point I want to make about this, and about all forms of sexual abuse and violence and exploitation of women, is these are not separate from the exploitation at work. They're not separate from the low wages. They're not separate from the amount of work that people do. This is the other side, if you like, the way in which women are demeaned in economic ways and in social ways. Also, they're demeaned sexually and not treated as serious human beings who have a right to control their bodies and a right to their dignity. So what I want to talk about today is some of these and where these kind of ideas are coming from, because what you've got is that you've got a double whammy for women, really, that they have these worse conditions of exploitation at work. They do the vast majority of domestic labour. They carry out what is, in these days in academia, is referred to as social reproduction, which means they carry out both the biological function of having children, and usually are the people who bring up the children that they have, but also, if you like, the social function. They tend to do jobs that are connected with sometimes it's called caring, although, you know, the conditions of exploitation under capitalism means that even caring jobs actually are very uncaring, so you don't have time. If you're a carer in a home, you don't have time to help somebody get their tea, or you don't have time to talk to them for 2 minutes, or you don't have time to worry about them. But these, what are called caring professions or jobs, are overwhelmingly ones that women tend to do. And therefore, what you've got is a system of social reproduction which relies incredibly heavily on unpaid labour, on goodwill, on people loving their children, their parents, their families, whatever it is that they do. Huge amount of capitalism exists not through a wage relationship, but through what people do as well outside of the wage relationship. And indeed, my argument is that capitalism could not last for 5 minutes without the unpaid labour of women, and to a lesser extent men, but to a far lesser extent men, within the home and within the household, within childcare being the most time-consuming and difficult area. Anybody who's delayed doing dusting from day after day, or possibly week after week, as some of us can confess to, certainly wouldn't be able to do that in the case of feeding children, getting them to school, getting them to bed, all the other things that take so much of people's time on top of the paid work that they do. And it's that role of women as well, which in my opinion leads to a lot of the stereotypes about women, that women are more caring individuals, or sometimes, but not always. That women are more likely to do these kind of jobs, that women are quite happy. It used to be when I was young, women are quite happy with lower wages because they don't really want careers, they don't really want to do very much, their husbands earn more, and that's the most important thing. All of those stereotypes are ones that we live with as a result of women's role in society. Now, why do women suffer this oppression? Why is this oppression continuing? Why does it keep continuing? And I would argue it keeps continuing because capitalism needs to divide people in order to sustain its role. We know it does it, we see it very clearly with racism, that, you know, there's another race or another nationality that's supposedly inferior to you, that doesn't deserve the same jobs as you, that doesn't deserve the same money as you. It's also something which affects LGBT people that are seen as outside of the norm sexually or family-wise, and therefore are treated in a discriminatory way. But it is absolutely central to society as a whole. After all, women are 50% of the population, and therefore an oppression which affects half of the population, the vast majority of whom are also working class, is one which is absolutely fundamental to capitalist society. And if you look at women's oppression, the argument which is always put by Marxists, and I think it's absolutely correct, there's all sorts of kind of ways you can look at it, but fundamentally the argument is that class society is the system which led to the oppression of women. That once you have private property, which is absolutely key to the development of class society, so too you have the need to control your inheritance, the need to control your family, the need to ensure you know that the man's children are the man's children. I mean, the women know who their children are after all, because they're the ones who give birth to them. But that isn't the same as with men. So all of these structures of class society, I'm talking about a long time before capitalist society, are ones which actually structure women's oppression into it. And the original reason for this is because you have a division of labour, and in all societies you have a division of labour, but the division of labour doesn't need to have any necessary inequality within it. There's no reason if you do one particular job or I do another job that those should be regarded as inferior or superior in any way. But the truth is that what has developed in class society is that the connection between having children, and not just having children, but bearing children, suckling them, caring for them until certainly they're old enough to be able to do things differently, is one which is very much connected with women and which women have no choice but to do. I mean, today, you can argue that a woman can have a child, doesn't need to breastfeed, doesn't need to look after that child itself, it can be looked after in childcare and so on. That wasn't the case for thousands and thousands of years of human history, and therefore that connection with women's biology was always there. Now, in the 21st century, there's no reason why having a child, or being somebody who potentially can have a child, or could potentially have a child, should make you in an inferior position. There's no reason for it. The technological advances that we've seen should be able to overcome most of those kind of problems, and a whole number of other problems like so-called women's health problems, you know, period pains and menopause and all the other things that suddenly HR departments have found a kind of, you know, menopausal awareness is the latest kind of thing they're worried about, but nobody puts any money or investment into finding ways to deal with these very, very fundamental problems. So there's no reason why that should be the case, except we live in a capitalist society where profit is the absolute key. And when you're talking about profit being absolute key, why the hell, if you're a capitalist, would you as an individual want to pay more money to a woman when you can pay less? Why would you want to give free childcare in your workplace when you don't have to do it, and it can be thrown back onto the responsibility of the individual family as to how the child is cared for? And if that's true of individual capitalists, it's also true of them collectively, that they don't want to have to provide what would be billions of pounds. Now actually, they could provide this easily. I was in a meeting this morning where I said that the first 5 weeks of the US attack on Iran cost the US between $22 billion and $31 billion. So when you're spending that money, which is just going up in smoke, actually you could be spending $31 billion a year on childcare and on socialising a lot of the functions of the family. So people don't have to worry about individual childcare. They don't have to feel that they've got to shop and cook every day. If you had cheap alternatives that people could go to, you could have all those kind of things. But collectively and individually, because profit is the key, no one capitalist will do this, and even collectively they're very, very reluctant to do it. They do it occasionally. They do it occasionally. They did it to a certain extent in the First World War, and to a much, much bigger extent in the Second World War, where people did have even children's hotels they had in some places for munitions workers in the Second World War, where you have British restaurants, which were communal restaurants, which were very cheap and, you know, good places to go, where people could get shoppers who queued up and shopped for people to get their food because they wanted the women working in the munitions factories. So capitalism can do it sometimes, but in 1945, as soon as the war ends, what happens? As soon as the war in Europe ends, what happens? They close the communal nurseries. They say, no, they're not available anymore. Women aren't going to be able to get equal pay. It was a commission on equal pay for women at the end of the Second World War, where they decided they just couldn't afford it. You know, that was it. So didn't get it for another, even how bad it is now, didn't get it for another 20 odd years. And then they say to women, you can't go and work in a shipyard or a factory, that's man's work. You can go back to working in a shop or an office or whatever it is that you're doing. So all of those things are to do with the nature of capitalism and the way in which it decrees effectively that you'll have social production but privatised reproduction, and that is the responsibility of the individual family. And that is why the family is absolutely key, in my opinion, the structure of the family. And I know the family's changed a lot, but fundamentally, most people still live in families. And even though, there's been big changes in that, for example, there's far more single parent families, gay and lesbian people can get involved, it can become partners and husbands and wives in same-sex marriages, all of which are obviously advances for people. But what they are trying to do is to fit them into the family form as well as everybody else, and that's the way that it really works. So I think when you look at it, you can overcome whatever biological problems that women might have in being able to do what they want to do as well as giving birth and caring for children. You can overcome the social conditioning, but I don't see any way that can be overcome within the constraints of private profit and the capitalist system, and therefore you need an alternative which actually looks to a different way of organising society, which can begin to lead to real equality. And what would that mean? I think when you look at what it would mean firstly that you would end the idea that women were in some way inferior, that every possible law or every possible social custom or any of those things would be seen as something where women are treated as completely equal. And that would be a step forward. It would be a step forward from the way that women are treated now. It would also be that you would say that firstly, sex is not a commodity. Sex is obviously a universal human function. It's something that people engage in, hopefully pleasurably. It's something that people do for a fair amount of part of their lives. It shouldn't be something where people are judged on who they have sex with, how they have sex, what they look like, whether they're looking in a way which is deemed as sexually attractive. If you take away sex and the whole act of sex and physical attraction and all those things from the question of commodification, it then becomes an individual choice between men, women, how they want to build relationships and how they want to live their lives. Secondly, you have to talk about production for need, not for profit. That if you think about what is produced in the world at the moment, I talked about arms and weaponry, which is a very, very big part of it, but also the incredible amount of waste that is produced, the incredible amount of goods that really, whether you need them or not, they're not particularly, there's nothing particularly great about having people in Thailand or China producing very cheap garments which then spend weeks and weeks on a container ship and then are sold in Primark for next to nothing and probably thrown away after a few months. That's not a logical way of clothing people or of having people living in a way, again, these are all questions that we can talk about. So production for need, what do people need? They need food, they need housing, they need clothing, they need basic wants. And then you can start talking about what other things that people want in terms of art and in terms of culture and in terms of all sorts of things that people, entertainment that people would do. You cannot do that properly under capitalist society, and therefore everything becomes a commodity to be bought and sold, and that's true of women themselves, and it's true of many of the goods that are produced by women, and it's true of the kind of way in which sex and personal relationships are seen. And perhaps the most horrible example of that, I think, is the sheer sort of scale of pornography that is available at the moment. And I'm not a person who's, I've never taken the view that pornography should be banned in the sense of, I don't think that particularly is a way forward. But I also think if you now have people's images of sex as referring to violence against women, referring to degradation of women, that is really a step backward, and we ought to think about what those kind of images and what those approaches to how women should act sexually and how men should act sexually. I think we need to look at what those are about. And of course, the final point is, if you do begin to achieve production for need, which needs a socialist society to do it, I hope that is absolutely clear, because we know none of the others are going to, we know no capitalist is going to decide to produce for need when they can produce for profit, which is what they always do, and they overproduce, so we get suddenly too many clothes or too many cans of beans or too many whatever it is. And then it's only when you've achieved that, so the beginning of organised collective rule of society, which is what socialism is. And then that takes you into what the Marxists have always described as the realm, from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. It's only then that people can develop their own ideas, their personalities in a genuine way, which isn't distorted by the competition and all the other sides of capitalism, which is so damaging to us. And it also takes us into the area of personal relationships, both between people of different sexes, but also relationships between children and adults, which at the moment, again, is completely distorted by a whole range of authoritarian ways that people are supposed to behave towards children. That all these things begin looking at these things differently and sharing kind of experience which can give people a future which is based on freedom rather than on necessity, is something that we have to fight for. And I think I'll just end by saying that when you look at the history of the socialist movement, you can trace some of these ideas about women's liberation. Look at somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft, who people will have heard about, who wrote in the late 18th century under the influence of the French Revolution, and talked very, very openly, and actually was a very brave woman who had a child outside of marriage, and that kind of just, she died very young in childbirth as well, and she, it's only after her death that she got the most terrible reputation for being a woman who had engaged in free love and living outside marriage and all these kind of things. Put very, very sophisticated ideas about women's equality and what it meant, different from how we phrase it now, but nonetheless very, very sophisticated. Alexandra Kollontai, who was a Russian revolutionary in the early 20th century, again puts very sophisticated ideas about how you can begin to break away from the oppression of women. You can do that even under capitalism, and that's hopefully what we're all trying to do. But it's when you can then talk about changing society in a fundamental way that you can begin to talk about women's oppression ending. And the Russians made, whatever the problems of the Russian Revolution, which were gigantic, but from 1917 onwards, 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, they passed laws which were utterly remarkable by world standards. They said marriage should no longer be anything to do with religion, and it should be free for people to divorce if either side wants it, just for the asking. Indeed, Trotsky was asked in the 1920s in an interview, is it true that women can get divorced in Russia just for the asking? And he said, is it true that there are countries in the world where you can't get divorced just for the asking? And they had very advanced ideas. They had socialised functions of the family. They had childcare which was collective. Now the problem they had was that the Russian Revolution was beleaguered from the start and didn't succeed, and eventually succumbed to Stalinism, which is all another story. And I think there's a meeting on Trotsky going on later on that perhaps will address some of these questions. But what they tried to do was a completely new and revolutionary way of looking at the world, and we have to find ways in the 21st century where we also find new and revolutionary ways of looking at the world and of how to end the oppression of women. Thanks.